By the time the stained glass started bleeding moonlight, the town had already lied to itself 3 times about what was really wrong with the sky. Folks in towns like this don't whisper their legends to scare children. They whisper them to stay alive. And the ones they don't dare say out loud, those are the ones that end up here on nights like this. As a whispering narrative's confession whispered into the dark, the moon didn't rise. It climbed too fast, too large, too red, dragging a thin ring of darkness around it like a bruise. The bell at St. Barachiel's church gave a single, hollow note even though no rope moved. Dogs that usually barked at everything didn't make a sound. Only the wind spoke, and even that sounded like it was holding its breath. The moon didn't rise. It climbed too fast, too large, too red, dragging a thin ring of darkness around it like a bruise. The bell at St. Barachiel's church gave a single, hollow note, even though no rope moved. Dogs that usually barked at everything didn't make a sound. Only the wind spoke, and even that sounded like it was holding its breath. On the hill where the church clung to the earth like a stone fingernail, the graveyard shifted. Old angel statues seemed to lean closer. Crosses that had stood straight for a century now tilted, as if trying to listen to the ground instead of the sky. Fog rolled between the headstones, deliberate as a living thing, hugging names no living throat had said in years. A howl rose up from somewhere deep in that fog. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was wrong. The sound climbed higher and higher until it scraped at the inside of your skull. And then right when every instinct braced for it to echo off the hillside, didn't it? It just stopped, as if something had reached out and pinched the night, closed around it down in the town. People pretended they hadn't heard it. They turned up televisions, turned down lamps, locked doors once, twice, 3 times. The old ones muttered prayers they said they'd forgotten. The young ones laughed too hard and too long at nothing. Up in the church, Father Elias knelt at the altar, hands clasped so tight the knuckles matched the marble. The candles around him burned with steady, unnatural flames. He wasn't praying for the town. He was praying the Pact would hold for just one more night. Folks in towns like this don't whisper their legends to scare children. They whisper them to stay alive. And if you ever ask about the night the Pact was broken, you'll see it, that tiny flinch in their eyes, like something inside them still hears a howl that never got the chance to echo. They'll tell you the story carefully, the way you'd handle glass that already has a crack. The town of Barachiel, hollow wrapped around the base of the church hill like it had grown there, brick by reluctant brick. On good days, the place just felt tired. Peeling paint, sagging porches, a main street that thought about dying every time another store closed. On bad days, when the clouds sat low and the hills felt too close, Barachiel's hollow felt like a throat someone had forgotten to unclench. Mara Hayes had lived there her whole life, long enough to know when the town was scared and when it was lying about being scared. She wiped down the counter at the all-night diner for the 4th time, listening to the same 3 locals at the same corner table pretend they weren't waiting for the bell to ring again. "It's just storms coming in," one of them, Reese, retired mechanic, always smelled like oil, an old cigarette, said, staring too hard at his untouched coffee. "Air pressure does things to sound." "Sure," Mara said. "Storms, that why the dogs went quiet?" He didn't answer. None of them did. The bell didn't ring. Instead, the neon clock buzzed above the pie case, its minute hand twitching. Toward midnight, under a flickering red halo, there were rules in Barachiel's Hollow. Some were written on signs. Most weren't written at all. Don't park along the hill road after dark. Don't let kids play near the tree line on the western ridge. Don't stay in the graveyard after the first bell. Don't look at the church windows when the moon is full. The rules sounded like superstition until you realized nobody broke them. Not the old, Not the young, not even the bored or drunk. Even the out-of-towners, if they stayed long enough, felt the way the night pressed in around those rules and decided not to test them. Mara stacked clean glasses on the shelf and caught her reflection in the chrome-dark hair-tied bag. Tired, eyes jaws set the way it always did when the sky felt too heavy. The door chimed as it opened, letting in a slice of cold air that smelled like wet stone and something metallic underneath, like old coins or fresh blood. Father Elias stepped in, rain clinging to his black coat, collar white as a bone chip. He rarely came down from the hill on nights like this. That he was here at all felt like a mistake the night itself would want to correct. "You're out late, Father," Mara said, because normal words were easier than admitting the room felt thinner with him in it. "Some nights refuse to be prayed through," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had bargained more than he'd confessed. "Coffee, strong, please," she poured. His hands shook once when he reached for the cup, just enough for the porcelain to tap the saucer. She pretended not to see. Through the diner windows, the church crouched on the hill, a darker shape against the dark. The stained glass window that faced town was famous in a small, unimportant way. It didn't show some robed saint with uplifted hands. It showed a figure with both arms stretched outward, palms towards the sky, standing between a wolf and a bat-winged creature. Above its head, the moon was painted as a perfect silver circle. At least, that's how it used to look. Lately, at certain angles, Loku swore the silver had deepened into something closer to red. Mara hadn't seen it herself. She made sure not to look when the moon was full. Reese cleared his throat at the corner table. "You going up early, Father? I heard folks saying it's stronger tonight." Mara heard the word he didn't say, the same word everyone swallowed like it had teeth. Stronger, hungrier, fuller. Father Elias didn't answer right away. He only stared into the coffee as if he might find absolution at the bottom. "The covenant holds," he said finally, and the room didn't relax so much as rearrange its tension into a shape they were used to. "It has held for 3 generations. It will hold tonight." It was the way he said it that worried Mara, as if he was trying to convince the coffee more than the people. Outside, something brushed along the diner's outer wall, a slow, dragging weight that made the glass hum in its frame. Mara's fingers tightened around the coffee pot handle. Reese's eyes shifted to the window, then back down. The other 2 men stared at the table. Knuckles, white around their forks like metal, would help if something decided to come in. "Probably a branch," Mara said, although the nearest tree was several feet from the wall. "If something ever leans on this town hard enough," Father Elias murmured, "branches won't be what cricked first." When he left, the bell over the door fluttered without sound, as if something had taken the noise before it could form. He walked back toward the hill with his shoulders squared against a wind that seemed to come from the direction of the church, not toward it. Mara watched him go, the hairs on her arms prickling. She didn't know much about theology, but she knew the look of a man who had already decided what he was willing to sacrifice. He passed under a street lamp, and for a moment his shadow looked too long behind him, not just stretched by the light, but jointed wrong, shoulders too wide, head tilted in a way his real skull never could have managed. She blinked, and it was gone. Ask the locals what they saw that week. Listen to the parts of the story they skip. Listen harder to the things they call nothing. The first body wasn't a person. It almost made it worse. 2 days before the red moon, Old Man Grady's cattle started refusing the western pasture. They pressed against fences that had held them for years, eyes rolling white whenever the wind blew from the church hill. When he finally forced 3 of them up there at dusk, cursing and prodding and telling anyone who'd listen that animals were getting soft, they didn't make it through the night. They found the carcasses at dawn, scattered like broken toys. No clean bite marks, no neat, predatory signatures. Just shredded meat and long, parallel tears in the ground where something had braced itself. The mud held the memory of massive paws that seemed to change shape the longer you looked. The sheriff said it was dogs. Big ones, maybe feral. Asterisk. The hunters in town went quiet because they knew what dogs did to a kill. And this wasn't it. Grady put a shotgun by his door and started sleeping in a chair with his boots on. He lasted 2 nights before he stopped sleeping altogether. He was the first one to say it out loud in front of other people. Wolf, not wolves, not plural, not a pack. One that could feel the singularity of it in their bones. At the same time, another story rode the same air on a different frequency. A stranger in a dark coat had been seen near the graveyard. Tall, too pale even for this town, moving through the fog like he was more comfortable in it than out of it. Some said they saw him standing by the church gate, hat tipped, as if listening. Others swore they watched him walk between the stones and never heard his footsteps. The sheriff shrugged that one off. "Too drifter," he said. "We get those." But people noticed how he only ever appeared at dusk, how he never touched the door of any place that still put a cross above it, how he seemed less like a man visiting the dead and more like a lamb, arrogantly taking inventory of the slaughterhouse. And in the middle of all of it, there was the church. Father Elias had been different lately, his sermons shorter, his eyes more bloodshot, his hands bandaged under his sleeves. He'd started wearing the old silver ring again, the one with the crescent wolf head etched into it that the previous priest used to wear. He never explained why Mara had seen him once, late, when she'd taken the long way home past the hill even though she knew better. The church windows were dark except for the big stained glass one, which burned like a wound against the sky. He stood outside, looking up at it, his shoulders trembling as if from cold or anger. There were claw marks, fresh ones, at the base of that wall, deep gouges in the stone, too high for any animal that walked on 4 legs. He knelt and pressed his mangled hands to them. For a moment, his breath came out in visible bursts, even though the air wasn't nearly cold enough for that. The moon wasn't full yet. There are nights when the world feels like it's inhaling, gathering itself for something. The night the Pact finally cracked began that way. Clouds streamed past the moon like they were in a hurry to get out of its way. The town emptied early, doors locking with a soft, quick finality of people who already knew the script. The hill road glistened with recent rain, every puddle catching a distorted smear of sky. Mara should have gone home. Instead, she walked up past the last houses where porch lights dared to shine, through the first fingers of fog that reached down from the graveyard as if checking whether the town was still there. Her heart thudded like it always did when she neared the line where the asphalt turned into cracked stone steps. They called it morbid curiosity, as if curiosity couldn't also be a kind of helpless gravity. At the church gate, she stopped. The iron bars were cold through her jacket sleeve. Beyond them, gravestones hunched under the fog, names half swallowed. The church's front door stood closed, but the large window burned with a muted red glow, like there was a sunset trapped inside and dying slow. The bell gave a single, low groan. No rope moved. Mara exhaled, a thin cloud in the cold. "You can still turn around," she told herself, and her voice sounded very small against the hill. "You can go home. You don't need to know." But people in towns like this did need to know. Not all at once, not even consciously, but in the marrow. It was how they kept breathing between stories. A figure moved along the edge of the fog. For one sick moment, she thought it was just the shadow of a headstone. Then it detached, long coat trailing, hat brim sharp. The stranger from the graveyard walked toward the gate, steps soundless. Even the gravel under his boots didn't dare crunch. Up close, his face was too smooth, too composed, as if nothing in this town could surprise him anymore. His skin held that strange, dry pallor that looked more like marble than flesh. His eyes, when they lifted to hers, weren't red like people liked to joke in vampire stories. They were a deep, old brown, the color of wood that had once been soaked in something darker and left to dry. "You shouldn't be here," he said politely, voice low and well-shaped. No accent, or maybe an accent from everywhere at once. "The hill belongs to other things on nights like this. So why are you here?" Mara asked. Bravery tasted like iron filings on her tongue. "Because I was invited," he said, "and because old agreements demand witnesses." He slipped past her through the gate without touching it, as if the hinges opened a fraction before his hands would have. The fog curled around his legs. Reluctant to climb higher, Mara didn't realize she was following until the gate clicked shut behind her. Asked the locals if they've ever walked somewhere their brain begged them to avoid. Watch the way their eyes tilt up toward the hill, whether they mean to or not, as they crossed the graveyards. Mara saw more clues laid out like a crime scene the town refused to file paperwork on. Deep paw prints in the soft ground. Then, several feet away, the same imprints stretched, toes elongating. Hill rising as if something had started to stand upright mid-step. Old markers pushed at odd angles, as though a large body had brushed by too close. A marble angel missing its lower jaw, teeth shattered around its feet. The church door swung inward before the stranger reached it. Father Elias stood inside the threshold. Vestments half on, collar undone, sweat pasted to his hairline. His bandaged hands gripped the edges of the doorway so tightly the skin around his nails went bloodless. "You're early," he said. "You're late," the stranger replied. Their eyes met like blades knocking. Mara should not have been able to hear their next words over the sound of the bells suddenly shuddering into a slow, steady toll. But the church had a way of bending sound when it wanted someone to hear. "The covenant still binds," Father Elias said. "As long as I stand, the line holds. You've misunderstood your place in this, priest." The stranger stepped into the faint light slanting from the candles behind Elias. The glow did not quite touch him. "You are not the line. You are the lock," and locks wear down. Something moved behind Father Elias, low to the ground at first, then higher. Mara caught a glimpse between his arm and the doorframe, a flash of grey fur under stone arches, the ripple of muscle, the glint of an eye-catching candlelight dot. Not human, not just animal. Her heart stumbled. "If your kind had kept your side," Elias said, "we wouldn't have to be here." "My kind did," the stranger said. "We starved ourselves in graveyards while the wolves fed in the forest. We left your town alone while you fattened your children on stories of us. And still, you call us monsters." He tilted his head, amused bitterness creasing the corners of his mouth. "All because you know what waits on your own side of the pact." Elias flinched, and the movement pulled his sleeve back. Mara saw the bandages clearly now. Dark crescents bloomed through the linen, not where something had torn him from the outside, but where something underneath had pushed out, as if claws had tested the limits of his skin and reluctantly withdrawn. The tolling bell stuttered, then stopped halfway through its next swing. The silence that followed felt too complete, like someone had erased a line of sound rather than let it fade in that pause. The moon slid free of its last veil of cloud and struck the stained glass window forlorn. The figure in the glass, the one standing between the wolf and the bat-winged shaped dash, changed. It was not a trick of light. It was not imagination. Where there had once been an androgynous saint with a placid face, there was now something else. The jaw longer, teeth suggested in the play of colored shards, eyes narrowed into a predator's focus. Fur seemed to crawl across the painted skin, caught mid-spread. Wings hinted at the shoulder blades, dark streaks spooling outward. The thing in the glass was becoming one of each. Both, neither. Mara realized, with a coldness that reached her bones, that the moon wasn't just shining on the window, it was waking it up. Inside, someone growled. It came from the shadows behind the altar, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the chest more than the ears, the sort of growl that didn't belong to a throat built strictly for words. Another voice, softer and more human, followed. "It hurts, Father." Elias's shoulders tightened. "Stay back," he called over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off the stranger. "The terms require us three, no more." "The terms," the stranger repeated, tasting the word, "yes." "Let us recite them while the new moon tears through old flesh." He stepped fully into the nave. As he did, every candle along the side aisles guttered but did not go out. They burned lower, like cowering things. "What's happening?" Mara whispered, barely aware she'd pushed closer to the doorway. Neither man answered her directly, but the church did, in its own way. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of old blood, damp stone, and something sharp and coppery that wasn't entirely physical. The architecture seemed to lean inward, pews creaking as if hundreds of invisible bodies were suddenly occupying them, all turning their gazes toward the front. Father Elias spoke like he was reading from an invisible page. "By moon and earth and blood split three," he intoned, voice gaining strength from somewhere that wasn't purely his lungs. "This place stands neutral ground. No fangs feed, no claws claim. No blood spilled here counts for any pack or line." The stranger Mara realized, finally, what he was. The words sliding cold and inevitable into place finished the verse. "And in return, the line of the lock keeps both beasts at bay," he said. "Your veins bind us as long as they beat. Your body bears the mark. Your life sits between our hungers." "You agreed," Elias said tightly. "We did," the vampire replied, "when the lock stood whole. But look at you." He moved faster than she could track, one moment at the center aisle, the next at the base of the altar steps, face inches from the priests. Mara's breath stopped. One misstep and those careful, civilized teeth would not remain so careful. Up close, Mara saw it. The tremor in Elias's cheek, the strained line of his jaw, the way the veins in his neck throbbed too close to the surface. His pupils were blown wide despite the light, rimmed by a faint, unnatural amber. "What happens?" the vampire murmured, voice dropping so low even the church had to lean in to hear. "When the lock starts to resemble the monster it holds back. Tell me, holy man, when you dream now, whose teeth do you feel in your own throat?" Elias's breath hitched, lips peeling back just a fraction. Mara glimpsed something behind his teeth. Not lengthened canines, not yet, but pressure, like the hint of fangs pressing from beneath the gum line. Not ready to break through, but no longer willing to stay hidden. "The line holds," he repeated, though the words now sounded more like a plea than a statement. "As long as I live, it holds. That," the vampire said gently, "is why we are here." The sound from behind the altar came again, this time a yelp cut short by a wet snap. Someone or something let out a choked cry that dissolved into panting. Mara leaned just enough to see. It was a boy, 16, maybe 17, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, shirt shredded along the shoulders and spine. He knelt on all fours on the cold stone, fingers splayed. His hands weren't fully hands anymore. The fingers had lengthened, nails blackened, splitting at the ends into something thicker, curve hinting toward claws. The bones of his wrists had shifted, tendons straining under the skin like cables pulled too tight. His back bowed, vertebrae pressing against the flesh in an angry, uneven ridge. His eyes caught hers. They were human, eyes wide, terrified, begging. But deep in the center, in the pupils dark, a faint ring of gold pulsed like a trapped ember. She knew him, everyone did. Joana Mercado, quiet kid, soft voice, kind a smile. The one who used to help Elias polish the candlesticks after services and always offered to carry Jimenez for old Mrs. Price because her hand shook. Now his body was betraying him in slow, agonized increments. It hurts, he repeated, fingernails gouges into the stone as his shoulders convulsed. I did what you said. I stayed inside. I drank his voice broke off into a coughing fit. Dark droplets spattered the floor. Elias flinched as if each drop struck him instead. I know, he said hoarsely. I know. It's too close this time. The moon is too red, the vampire offered. Hungry, honest. He turned slightly, enough to address the boy without removing the knife edge of his attention from the priest. You feel it, don't you, whelp? The pull in your marrow, the call in your teeth, the lock weakening each time he channels your curse into his prayers. Jonah's breath came in ragged bursts. His jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like two opposing forces were pulling on his face from the inside. His cheeks twitched, lips thinning, then ballooning with each breath. The bones didn't quite know which form to commit to. We made a deal, Elias said, desperation cracking through the ritual cadence. The wolves get one in every generation, one vessel, one bearer. You promised, as long as we kept the line, you would not feed in this town. And we kept that, the vampire agreed. His eyes flicked to Mara, as if to say, see? You're still here, aren't you? But your line isn't pure anymore, is it, Elias? The wolf's mark goes deeper now. It touches more than just the lock. His gaze dropped to the priest's chest, as if he could see through fabric and bone. Your heart's not entirely yours, he murmured. Is it? Mara saw it then. The bandages on Elias's hands weren't from some accident in the sacristy. They were where his own fingers had distorted, nails tearing through flesh as something inside them lengthened in moments of lost control. Under his collar, something crawled under the skin line's curves, like a brand regenerating with each beat. The pact had always been simple, as far as stories went. Long ago, the werewolves and vampires of this region had grown tired of losing territory and Bodis to each other. The humans were collateral, meat spilled between wars. So they'd carved out a fragile truce. One town, one hill, one church where neither side fed and neither side hunted. In exchange, the town gave something unthinkable. A family. One bloodline raised at the altar, fed on sacrament and secrecy. Every few generations, one of them would be chosen as the lock. Their veins would carry a drop of both curses, bound by blessings and old words, anchoring the truce. Their life expectancy wasn't great. Their death was never peaceful. Father Elias had stepped into that role, bearing both fangs and fur in potential, keeping them dormant with ritual and agony until the moon changed. No one survives the night. It chooses without leaving something behind. The vampire moved back, giving the length of the nave a cool, appraising glance. The wolves grow restless, he said. We smell what they smell. Your blood doesn't just bind anymore. It calls. The beast in you is waking, priest. You're not the lock now. You're the door. When you break, everything you've held floods out. Then help me reinforce it, Elias snapped. Composure fracturing. You have old magics, your kind used to sew curses shut for sport. Don't stand there and what? The vampire smiled, small and sharp. Help the mutts maintain their advantage. No, Tonight, we renegotiate. Jonah choked on a groan, his spine arched violently, shirt tearing fully down the back. Vertebrae bulged, reshaping. For a heartbeat, his silhouette against the far wall looked canine, then human, then something caught between. Mara's stomach lurched. She'd seen werewolf movies. Cheap streaming services full of bad CG and worse dialogue. They'd never felt like this, never like watching someone's own body declare war on them one bone at a time. Elias staggered, a hand pressing to his chest. His breathing synced unintentionally with Jonah's. Every time the boy's ribs strained outward, Elias's flared. Every time claws pushed against Jonah's fingers, the priest's knuckles stiffened. Mara realized, with cold clarity, that the curse wasn't content with just one vessel anymore. It wanted lineage. "You did this," Elias whispered to the vampire. "Your line, your thirst. The Pact siphoned both hungers into my house, and now they've fermented together," the vampire said. "Do you know what happens to blood when you mix predator with predator and leave it under a full moon's light for long enough?" He smiled fully then, the tips of his teeth finally. "Where'd you get something new?" The first true howl of the night ripped through the church. It came from Jonah, but it also didn't. His voice shattered halfway through, the lower register taken over by something that vibrated the pews. The pitch climbed and climbed, threatening to break glass. And this time, when it should have echoed, it did once, twice, a third time, overlapping itself, like multiple throats in one body, trying to sing the same agony. Outside, in the graveyard, the fog recoiled from the church walls. Something large moved at its outer edge, pacing, frustrated. Claws tested the invisible line of the consecrated ground and found it still, barely, holding. For now, Mara dropped to her knees, palms slamming the stone. A vision wavered. Locals say the moon never glows the same after that night. Not here. Within that chaos, something colder, more precise moved. The vampire stepped away from the altar, coat whispering against stone. His eyes were bright now, hungry, not in the way of a starving man, but in the way of someone standing on the threshold of a long-awaited experiment. "Here is my offer," he said. "Let the lock break. Let the hybrid be born. We both drink from the new bloodline, share the offspring of your mistake. No more starving, no more pretending wolves are the only ones allowed to howl here." Elias stared at him, shaking his head even as his body trembled with the same rhythm as Jonah's. The lines of his face shifted in the candlelight, sometimes priest, sometimes something else entirely. "If we do that," he said slowly, "there will be no pact, only war." The vampire's smile didn't falter. "Yes," he said, "but it will be honest war." Somewhere behind Mara, the front doors slammed open. Reese and two of the other men from the diner stumbled in, guns drawn. Faces pale but set. The sheriff followed, jaw clenched so hard it looked carved from the same stone as the church. Rules or not, there's always someone who decides it's better to die shooting than die waiting. "Everyone away from the boy," the sheriff barked, voice cracking. "We end this now," the vampire sighed, as if inconvenienced by a cough during a symphony. "You are late to your own story, humans," he said. "But if you insist on decorating the aisle with more blood, who am I to object?" Elias held up a trembling hand. "No guns," he rasped. "You fire in here, you'll rupture things you don't understand." "There are layers," Reese echoed. "Doc, that kid's bones are doing things bones don't do. There's something in the graveyard that's been chewing cattle like their gum. And that thing," he jerked his chin at, the vampire, who gave a mock little bow, "is standing where my wife said she'd never set foot again. Forgive me if I'm done listening to layers." The sheriff leveled his shotgun at Jonah, hands trembling. His eyes shone with the kind of horror reserved for killing, something wearing the face of a boy you'd given rides home. "We stop it here," he muttered. "We stop it before it spreads." Jonah lifted his head. His lower face had started to change, jaw thickening, lips peeling back involuntarily to reveal teeth that were no longer aligned for words. The shift made his attempted smile grotesque, bloody, beautiful in a terrible way. "Please," he croaked through the rearranging anatomy, I don't want to hurt." His back spasmed, arching, a wet sound popping along his spine. The muscles in his shoulders tore and reckoned, ropes shifting under the skin into new configurations. Hair sprouted in uneven patches, then flowed, a slow-motion wildfire of fur. Mara lunged without thinking, grabbing the barrel of the sheriff's gun and forcing it down. "Don't you dare shoot him in front of the altar," she snarled, surprising herself. "If this is where it started, this isn't where we end it." The vampire's eyebrows lifted. "Interesting," he murmured. "The lamb finds a growl." Something hit the church from the outside. A massive weight slammed into the wall beneath, the stained glass making the entire building shudder. Dust rained from the rafters. Cracks darted across the old mortar like lightning. A deeper, older howl rolled through the stones. Not Jonah's, not whatever was growing inside him. This one belonged to the thing that had been pacing the graveyard, waiting for a line to fail. The werewolf Friol full-formed, unbound, had arrived. The window exploded, shards of colored glass blew inward, a storm of saints and symbols turned into knives. Moonlight flooded the nave, not gentle, not silver. It poured in like a spilled wound, painting everything it touched in burning red. For one impossible second, everything hung suspended, glass hanging in the air like frozen rain, candles arrest in mid-flicker, flames stretched sideways in a wind that hadn't physically reached them yet. The vampire's coat mid-sway, the hunter's guns mid-dame, Mara's hair mid-dash-whip, and at the center of it, in that crimson storm, Father Elias, the brand under his collar flared, visible even through the fabrica snarling wolf's head encircling a stylized bat's wing. Both jaws open, biting each other's tails in a broken loop. The lines glowed the same color as the moon pouring through the window. The lock in him broke. There is no delicate way to describe what happened to his body. It did not neatly extend or elegantly reconfigure. It convulsed, every joint snapping, not once, but multiple times, as the hinges of his bones sought new directions. His hands tore free of their bandages, fingers elongating, knuckles swelling, nails blasting out into curved, black talons that carved grooves into the altar as he clutched at it. His spine rippled under the vestments, vertebrae punching against his skin, then pushing on through, fur erupting in jagged lines. His face stretched, nose cracking, teeth shredding his own lips as they grew. For a moment, his eyes looked at my recognition, apology, terror, and then they were drowned in molten amber. He roared. It was not a werewolf's howl, not entirely. There was too much articulate rage in it, too much of the human voice still woven through the growl. It hit the vampire like a physical force, shoving him back a step. The creature that rose from the wreckage of the priest's body stood between the altar and the moon-slashed window, framed like the figure in the glass. Always predicted, half fur, half shadow, jaws full of too many teeth, some fanged downward like a wolf, others needle-sharp like a bat, ears pointed yet ragged, as if torn between two sets of instincts. Its chest rose and fell in heaves that seemed to strain the boundaries of its own cage. Its eyes were mismatched. One burned gold, the other glowed a dark, wet red. The first hybrid outside, the full werewolf snarled, claws scraping along the stone as it circled, unable to cross the consecrated threshold, but furious at being denied. Its silhouette loomed through the shattered window, gap massive shoulders, fur bristling, mouthed a long, trembling line of teeth around the shape of a growl. The hybrid turned its gaze toward Jonah. There was something like kinship there. The boy's transformation had stalled, arrested at the half-state where humanity and beast tore at each other in equal measure. His hands were paws, but his eyes were still, stubbornly. As he stared at the creature that had been his priest, chest heaving. "Is that what I become?" he whispered, voice a broken mix of 3 registers. The hybrid's lips peeled back. The vampire stepped forward, hands held slightly out, palms placating. "Listen to me," he said to the hybrid. "You are the lock no longer. You are the key to something grander. Come with me. We shape a new law under this moon. No more starving in graveyards. No more pretending these animals." He flicked a hand toward the humans. "Are anything but collateral." The hybrid's gaze dropped to Mara. She saw Elias for a heartbeat, saw the man who'd baptized children, buried their grandparents, listened to confessions thicker with grief than sin, saw his shame, his horror at what his body had become, his terror of what it might do if left untethered. His giant clawed hand twitched. "Ask yourself, if you wore a curse like that in your blood, how many nights would you last before you broke your own skin trying to dig it out?" The hybrid moved fast, but not toward the humans. It leaped past them, toward Jonah. The hunters shouted, guns lifting on reflex. The sheriff pulled the trigger first, the blast echoing like thunder trapped in a jar. The slug should have taken the creature in the side of their head. It didn't. The hybrid twisted midair, impossible angles made possible by bones that had forgotten the limits of their former shape. The shot grazed its shoulder, tearing out a spray of fur and meat, but not slowing it. It landed over Jonah, claws braced on either side of the boy's shaking body. For one horrible second, Mara thought it would rend him, snap his neck, end his suffering the way a predator cleans up a flawed cub. Instead, it did something worse. It bit its own arm. Teeth sank into its flesh, ripping through hybrid hide. Dark blood spilled, thick and steaming, reeking of iron and something older, something like burnt leaves and grave dirt. It dripped, hot, into Jonah's open mouth as he gasped in shock. The boy convulsed, where the curse had once gnawed outward from his own marrow. Now something flooded in from outside, crashing through his veins with all the subtlety of a flood through a rotten dam. His eyes rolled back. The fur on his arms writhed, then smoothed, then thickened in new, more deliberate patterns. His spine straightened, then bent again, but this time with purpose, as if answering a design instead of fighting one. The vampire watched, fascinated. "You give him some of your line?" he breathed. "You share the burden. Clever beast or selfless priest?" Hard to tell, now. The hybrid threw back its head and roared again, this time not in agony, but in defiance. Outside, the full werewolf answered, claws tearing at the earth in frustration. The line was broken, the pact shattered. Neutral ground, no longer neutral. And yet, in that chaos, something like choice flickered. The hybrid turned toward the vampire. For all his composure, for all his centuries of predation, the creature of the graveyard took one involuntary half-step back. Not much, not noticeable to humans, enough. "You think you'll be the first to drink from him," the hybrid said. The words were mangled through the monster's throat, vowels shredded, consonants chewed. But they were words. Elias still lived in there, somewhere between the teeth. "You won't," he growled. "You weren't there when I begged the moon to take this from my line. You didn't hear what it said back." "Enlighten me," the vampire said dryly, though his hands had dropped. fingers curled into ready claws. The hybrid's eyes flashed. "It doesn't choose what it touches," he said. "It just shows us what was already waiting to come out." He lunged. The clash between them was nothing like the elegant duels of vampire romance novels or the choreographed brawls of low-budget werewolf flicks. It was ugly, brutal, animal. Claws versus preternatural speed, fangs versus centuries of practiced evasion. They tore the nave apart. Pews splintered under their weight. Candles toppled, backs exploding in small white lakes. Stone chips flew as bodies slammed into columns, the air filled with snarls, hisses, wet impacts. At one point, the vampire was on the hybrid's back, teeth sinking into the thick fur at its neck, trying to drain the new bloodline straight from the source. The hybro twisted, grabbed him by the front of his coat, and slammed him into the floor so hard the stone cracked in a spiderweb around his head. He didn't die. Vampires don't die that easily. But even old predators feel it when something younger and hungrier gets its hands on them. "Sharith," Reese gasped. "We need to, I know," the man said. His voice shook, but his hands were steady as he aimed not at the monsters, but at the line of cracked stone where consecration met raw earth. "We can't kill them, but we can change the board. 1 shot, 2, 3. He fired at the foundation, at the spots any old-timer in the town could have told you were the thin places where the original blessing had been spoken, where the first lock had knelt, where tears and blood had soaked to stone in the same night. Each blast shattered more than rock. The invisible circle that had kept the full werewolf outside buckled, flared, then ruptured. The creature outside howled. Sound of savage joy and long-denied territory suddenly opened. It burst through the ruined window, fur like midnight oil, eyes like coals smashed under a boot. Teeth, too many, too long, too eager. It landed in the middle of the nave, claws skidding sparks along broken stone. For a moment, hybrid, vampire, wherewithal faced each other. 3 hungers, 3 histories, 1 moon, red and full, burning its attention down on them. No one remembers who moved first. Some say the werewolf went for the vampire, scenting old rival blood. Others swear the hybrid leaped between them, driven by the last echo of Elias's need to keep his monsters apart. Mara remembers only the sound a triple-layered snarl that vibrated through her ribs and made her teeth ache. The fight that followed didn't feel like it belonged in a church. It felt like the church had been waiting for it. In the chaos, Jonah rose. He was taller. The changes the hybrid's blood had forced into him weren't as violent, but they were just as complete. His limbs had lengthened into something built for sprinting and leaping, his fingers tipped with controlled claws. His face held the same predatory structure as the hybrid's, but scaled to a leaner, younger frame. His eyes, though, were both gold. He looked at Mara, breath steaming. "I can feel it," he said, his voice layered, human and not. "The pull, the hunger, the pull, the choice. You can still turn away from it," she said, because it was the only hope she could imagine. His smile was sad and sharp. "No," he said, "but I can decide where it points." He turned toward the melee. Vampire and werewolf were locked in a vicious tangle, each tearing at the other's flesh with centuries of hatred. The hybrid circled them, looking for an opening, for a strike that wouldn't dismantle the fragile. Bloody balance entirely. Jonah didn't hesitate. He leaped, landing beside the hybrid. They met each other's eyes. In that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. It was lineage, an apology, and defiance all at once. The curse in their veins recognized itself, understood it would never be alone again. They attacked as one. The vampires of the old lines tell stories now, low and displeased, about the night the beasts fought like they'd learned strategy from their own prey. Every time the vampire tried to slip behind the fully formed werewolf, hybrid claws herded him back. Every time the werewolf tried to bring its full, brutal weight to bear on the hybrid, Jonah darted in, slashing hamstrings, drawing attention away. It was brutal. It was beautiful. It was the night the pact ended and something else, nameless and raw, began. No one could say how long it lasted. Time in that church bent around blood and breath in the end. It was not silver or stakes that decided things. It was choice, the hybrid, bleeding from a dozen wounds, fur-matted, one arm hanging at a wrong angle, grabbed the werewolf by the scruff mid-lunge and slammed its massive head into the altar. The stone cracked. The old symbols carved there, crosses interlaced with older, stranger marks shattered. The werewolf reeled, stunned, dazed enough to expose its throat for 1/2 second longer than was wise. The vampire saw an opportunity. He dove, fangs aimed for that vulnerable stretch. The hybrid moved faster. It lunged 2 knots at the werewolf, but at the vampire. They collided mid-air. The hybrid's claws sank into the vampire's chest, not just tearing flesh, but pulling, drawing, like a man trying to rip rot out of a wound with his bare hands. The vampire shrieked, more in outrage than fear. His blood spilled, dark and slow, smoking where it touched the hybrid's fur. "You want my line in this?" he snarled. "Fine. Take it. Choke on it." The hybrid opened its jaws and bit down. For an instant, all 3 curses met in the same body. The church could not hold it, light red from the moon, white from some old, hidden blessing, black from the spaces between exploded outward. Everyone was thrown back, slammed against pews, walls, floor. Mara's breath left her in one long, astonished cry. Then dash silence, dust drifted, candles sputtered. The red moon dimmed a shade, as if relieved, where hybrid, vampire, and full werewolf had stood. There was now only one shape. It crouched on all 4s in the middle of the nave, head lowered, breath soaring. Slowly it rose, taller than a man, shorter than the full beast had been. Fur darked, but streaked with lighter bands that caught the candlelight in strange ways. Wings did not sprout, but the shadow it cast on the far wall hinted at things that were not entirely lupin. It lifted its head, its eyes opened gold, red, and something else flickered there, layered like memories. It looked at Jonah, the boyno, the young thing that had once been only a boy-stood swaying. Blood dripped from his claws. His chest rose and fell like he'd run for hours. Their gazes locked. The town would argue for years about what passed between them in that look. Some, said the elder, creature declared itself alpha, and the younger bowed, first of a new pack. Others swore they saw mutual respect, as if the prisoners had realized they were also their own jailers. Then the larger thing, the new, unnamed apex, turned to the shattered window. It howled. The sound climbed and climbed higher and higher, carrying every story ever whispered in Barach's hollow about the hill, the church, the things that walked between graves. When it should have echoed, it did dot, once, twice, dot a 3rd time, then a 4th, thinner, higher, from Jonah's throat. Outside the hills answered. Ask the locals where they were when the howls layered that night. Some will say in bed, some will say in closets. A few will say on their knees beside doors they weren't sure would mean anything. They all heard it. The creature looked back at the humans. Mara braced, expecting slaughter. Instead, it spoke, not in words, not even in language, in intention. We will not be your secret anymore. Then it turned and leaped through the shattered window frame, out into the graveyard, into the fog that swallowed it with reluctant awe. Jonah hesitated on the threshold. He looked at Mara one last time. If this reminds you of something you've heard, he said softly, voice braided from boy and beast, you're not alone. Then he followed. The vampire was gone. No ash, no body, only a smear of dark on the stone that refused to dry, as if even in defeat, his line refused to fully die anywhere but on its own terms. Father Elias lay where the hybrid had first risen, human once more. His body was wrecked, bones at wrong angles, skin torn where fur had burst through. But his face looked strangely peaceful, as if the war inside him had finally gone quiet. Mara knelt beside him, tears tracking clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. His eyes fluttered open one last time. "You need new rules?" he whispered. "New stories. Tell them the moon didn't do this. We did." His gaze flicked to the window, what was left of it. "The pact was never between monsters and men," he murmured. "It was between what we are and what we're willing to become." He exhaled. The candle nearest him went out. They buried him at dawn, in the graveyard he'd kept haunted with his own exhausted mercy. The church was never the same. They rebuilt the window, eventually couldn't stand the empty hole gaping at the town. The new stained glass showed no saint, no wolf, no bat. Just a moon, divided into 3 uneven pieces, each a different shade. On some nights, when the light hits it wrong, people swear they see a shape moving behind the colored glass. Something standing between the pieces of the moon, holding them apart. The town changed its rules. They still locked their doors on red moons, still told their children to avoid the hill, but they stopped pretending the monsters were all out there. They knew now the thin line between man and beast was not a line at all. It was a choice made over and over, under skies that sometimes watched and sometimes judged. Ask the locals about that night, they'll look away before answering. Some claim the pact has gone entirely, that now it's chaos, tooth against tooth, claw against claw. Others whisper about a new covenant written in hybrid blood, where the creatures of fang and fur police their own in exchange for being allowed to exist in the cracks of the world. Every now and then, when the clouds roll low over Barach's hollow and the moon swells fat and red, someone hears a howl, not from the hills, from the church, a layered sound, old and young, wolf and not wolf. Rage and protection tangled into one long, impossible note. Locals say the moon never glows the same after that night. They're not wrong. You'll see it if you ever stand at the base of that hill, looking up at the church. The light on the window doesn't just shine, it watches, and if you listen hard enough, under the wind, under the creak of old stone and older roots, you might hear a promise whispered between unseen teeth. The night remembers the pacts you break. It also remembers the ones you're too afraid to make. If you're still here, the dark hasn't let you go yet. Stories like this don't just pass through you. They sink in. They curl up somewhere behind your ribs and wait for the next full moon in your life. The next moment when something inside you wants to stand on its hind legs and look back at the sky. If you've ever lived in a town with a hill, people avoid, a road folks won't drive after midnight, a church window they don't look at when the clouds thin, leave a word below. Someone else might need the warning before their own pact breaks. And if you find yourself listening for howls you swear you'll never hear where you live, you're already closer to this story than you think. If the night followed you this far, let it leave a mark, leave a word below so another wanderer sees the warning, and let the pack know you're still listening. Subscribe to Whispering Narratives before the next full moon, because the stories that find you once have a way of coming back.